Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the 2020 election polls at this point in time of the month of May and comparing it to the 2024, this election, on 538.com. And we're going to be applying it to the electoral map and basically see the comparisons between the polls that we're getting within these swing states compared to May of 2020 and now May of 2024. But before we get started, make sure you guys are subscribed and click the bell so you don't miss out on any of my content. And also, we have memberships, so if you are interested in that, you can find the link in the description section. Now back to the topic of today's video. Now back in the 2020 election, as of May 2nd, the day I'm recording this, Biden had a 6-point advantage lead over Donald Trump. And now you compare that to this election in 2024, in which Trump is leading nationwide as of May 2nd. This point in time, back in the 2020 election, Biden was up by 6. Now it's Trump up by 0.7. And basically, I believe this is the popular vote nationally, which is not good news for Joe Biden. Because if any Republican wins a popular vote, they are more than likely already going to, they have a certified victory at this point. Because Republicans have been winning without the popular vote. But because Trump has a popular vote, that basically certifies his victory. But let's take a look at the map compared to 2020 and 2024 polls as of this point in time, basically the month of May, with all these swing states. Let's fill out some of these states. And one thing to mention is that some of these electoral votes in some of these swing states have decreased and increased. For example, California used to have 55 electoral votes back in the 2020 election. Now it's dropped down to 54. And another example is Florida used to have 29 electoral votes. Now in 2024, it has 30. So the electoral votes in some change has made adjustments, and they have changed. So to start off this video, let's begin with the state of Iowa. So back in the 2020 election, Trump was leading in this state by roughly 3.3% as of May 2nd, this point in time. And now, compare that to 2024 polls in which Trump has a consistent lead in this state on average by 10 to 11%, which is double digits, considered a safe margin in my opinion. So already, Trump is performing 7 points better than where he did according to the polls. And by the way, this actually underestimated him. He won this state on election day by 8%, I believe. So that's already a 5-point underestimate. And one other thing to mention is that in terms of voter registration, Republicans had made gains within these last 4 years. Back in the 2020 election, Republicans only led in terms of registration in this state by 13,000. Now it's gone up to 148,000. So this state only has gotten redder over time. So Trump was winning this state of Iowa by a lean margin in 2020. And now you compare that to 2024, he's winning the state by a safe margin. On average, he is cracking double digits. So this is a significant difference when we compare these polls. Back in 2020, Trump is up in Iowa by 3 as of May. And now, May of 2024, Trump is up by 10, which is a big increase and good news for the former president. And considering that May polls in 2020 underestimated Trump by 5 points in the state, that goes to show you that Trump can actually win Iowa by 15 points, considering that he's up by 10, and if they underestimate him by 5, as they did in 2020, he's going to win it by 15 points. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that could be a scenario when you apply the actual polling error. And now moving on to the state of Ohio. Biden actually had a lead in this state by nearly 2 points in May of 2020 in this state of Ohio. And now you compare that fast forward 4 years later to 2024, in which Trump has a consistent lead of 9 to 10 points. You can see right here, you compare it to 2020 polls, Trump is up by 9.5% in the state of Ohio. And now they actually had Biden up on May 2nd of 2020 by nearly 2 points in the state of Ohio, which that was a massive polling error because Trump ended up winning this state by 8% on election day. And so if you were to fill out the polls from May of 2020, Biden's going to win Ohio by a tilt margin. And that was a massive polling error. And now you compare it to now, Trump is going to win this state by a likely margin at the end of the day. And now moving on to the state of Colorado. Biden was winning this state on average by double digits in May of 2020, so that's going to be safe, as well as New Mexico. And then, by the way, Democrats have gained in terms of voter registration in Colorado by roughly 4,000 in the last 4 years. So Colorado is actually getting more bluer, and it actually gained 1 electoral vote. It was at 9 in 2020. Now it's at 10 electoral votes. And it's, the state is actually only getting bluer. And so you compare that to 2020 polls in which Biden is up on average by 9 to 10 points in the state of Colorado. And New Mexico, it's slightly closer. He's up by a likely margin of 8 points. So you compare these, two maps from 2020 and now in 2024. And then as for some of these Sunbelt states, in Texas, Trump is leading on average by 11 points. So he's cracking double digits when you compare that to 2020 polls, in which this state was a whole lot closer. But in 2024, as of May, Trump is comfortably winning the state of Texas. So Trump only had a lead of roughly 2.5%, so 2 to 3 points on average as of May of 2020. And you compare it to now, which Trump is up by 11 points. Trump only was winning by a lean margin, and now he's winning it by a safe margin. So these are very, very different maps. And this is the 2020 map so far. We have, a lot more swing states to fill out before we end off the video. And then as for Florida, Republicans have gained significantly in terms of voter registration. Back in 2020, Democrats actually led by 97,000. And then you fast forward 4 years later, in 2024, Republicans lead in terms of voter registration by 888,000. That is a significant difference and increase in favor of Republicans. Miami-Dade County went to Biden in 2020. Ron DeSantis flipped it in 2022. And Trump is on track to flip it from blue to red in 2024. So you can see the shifts in the trends go in favor of Republicans. It's basically a lost cause for any Democrat at this point. Florida has just become too red at this point in time. A lot of that Hispanic vote has shifted heavily to the right in favor of Donald Trump. And you take a look at the 2020 polls as of May, Biden was up in the state of Florida in 2020 of May by 2.5%. So that's actually a lean margin at the end of the day. And then you compare it to 2024 polls in which Trump has a double-digit lead in the state on average by between 10 to 12 points. And so that's a big increase for the former president. And if we were to fill out the 2020 polls as of, May at this point in time, then Biden was winning in Florida by a lean margin. And that was a massive polling error as Trump actually won this state by the polar opposite by a lean margin. And so when you fill out these maps, you can see that Biden was up in Florida in 2020, even though he still lost it by a lean margin. And you compare it to 2024 polls, in which Trump is up by a safe margin. These are two completely different maps, and you can spot very significant differences. And now, moving on to the state of Minnesota, Biden was up in this state on average by 4.5%, which is kind of surprising because he had bigger gains anywhere else. And you saw he had the BLM momentum here. It pushed the Minneapolis area to the left. Suburban women supported Biden significantly in this state. So he was up in this state at this point in time back in 2020 by a lean margin. You compare that to now, in which Biden actually has similar leads in this state. He's up by roughly 4% in 2024 in this state. And back in 2020, in May, Biden was also up by 4.5%. So basically both were lean margins for Joe Biden. And now, moving on to the state of New Hampshire, Biden had a lead of roughly 5 percentage points in the state of New Hampshire back in 2020. And now you compare that to 2024, in which his lead actually increased quite a bit. He's up by 6 to 7% on average as of May at this point in time. And so Biden's actually performing better in New Hampshire in this election than where he did 4 years ago, which is kind of odd because it's the complete opposite of where the nation as a whole is, which it shifted towards the right. But apparently, New Hampshire is one of the fewer swing states actually is favoring Biden more than it did in the previous election, which is kind of odd. So Biden was winning this state by a lean margin as of May of 2020. And now you compare that to 2024, he's actually winning it by arguably a likely margin. So this is actually the fewer states where he's actually improving on his margin from 2020. Because you would typically say that Biden is actually losing support among these swing states. But New Hampshire is one of the fewer ones in which he's actually doing better in, just like Colorado. And now moving on to the state of Virginia. So back in the 2020 election, in this point in time, May 2nd, the day I'm recording this, Biden had a 7.6% lead in the state of Virginia, which is going to be considered a likely margin. And now you compare that 4 years later to 2024, this election, in which Biden's lead has shrunk. He's up in the state today by roughly 5 to 6 points on average. And so he was winning the state back in 2020 as of May by a likely margin. And now you compare it to 2024, he's winning it by a lead margin. So that's going to be a slight increase for the former president, Donald Trump. And keep in mind that the governor here endorsed Donald Trump. And he's a very well popular governor. He has approval rating of, I believe, 58% right now. So maybe that can sway a few voters in favor of Trump to narrow up and tighten up the race of Virginia in 2024, but still, Biden is more than likely going to hang on to this state. It's just too much for Trump to overcome at the end of the day. And now moving on to the state of North Carolina. So at this point in time in the 2020 election, May 2nd, Biden had a 3-point lead in the state of North Carolina, which was a pretty bad polling error, as Trump still won this state by roughly 1.5%. And so when Georgia and Arizona flipped to Joe Biden, North Carolina did the exact opposite, and it stayed red for Donald Trump. So that goes to show you how much more of a red state North Carolina is than Georgia, as you would may think. And now you compare Joe Biden's lead of 3% in this state back in May of 2020 to 2024. 4 years later, you would find that Trump has a lead in this state of 6.5%, which is a lean margin. And now Biden was up by a lean margin in 2020 in this state. And so when you fill out the map, you would find that North Carolina was blue by 3 points for Joe Biden at this current point in time in Trump's presidency. And now at this point in time in Biden's presidency, 4 years later in 2024, Trump has a 6% lead in this state. So pretty big shifts. And one thing to mention is that Republicans have gained in terms of voter registration. 4 years ago, back in 2020, Democrats had the advantage in 391,000 in terms of voter registration. Now, 4 years later, in 2024, this election, that number has shrunk. They still have the lead, but it's down to only 171,000. So this state has slightly gotten redder over the last 4 years. And now moving on to the deep southern state of Georgia. At this point in time in Trump's presidency, he was actually leading in the state in May of 2020 by 1.3%, which actually underestimated Joe Biden slightly by around a percentage point. Biden ended up winning by roughly 11,000 votes. And so you compare this to 2024 polls in which you would find Trump is leading by more in this state, on average by roughly 5 to 6 percentage points in this state. So in 2020, it was a tilt margin for Trump, and now in 2024, it's going to be a lean margin, so a slight increase for the former president. So this is the 2024 map, where Trump is leading Georgia by 5 to 6 points, and now you compare it to the 2020 map, in which Trump is still leading Georgia, but it was way closer, let me fill it red, by a tilt margin of 1% as of May. So this map is obviously not complete yet, but you can take a look at where we are currently in this video. This is the 2020 map, and now this is the 2024 map. You can spot major differences, and you can tell that the nation overall has just shifted towards the right in terms of May polling in 2024 compared to May polling back in 2020, 4 years ago at this point in time. And one of the main reasons why you saw a 6-point swing to the left in the state of Georgia back in 2020 was because Biden did tremendously well among African American communities. He got roughly 88% of the vote. And in this time around, I think he can drop or lose a lot of that support. He might get as low as 80% if Trump is lucky enough. Biden only gets 70% among black support. And Trump is currently polling 25%, so basically 1/4 among that minority group. And if that is the real numbers on election day, then I can imagine and I can tell you that Georgia is going to be one of the more easier flips for the former president. And now moving on to the state of Nevada. So at this point in time in Trump's presidency in May 2020, Biden had a 4.5% lead in the state of Nevada. He was winning it by a lean margin. And you fast forward 4 years later in 2024, this election in which this state had tremendously shifted towards the right in favor of Donald Trump. Trump is leading in this state, and he was not 4 years ago. You find on average Trump has a 5-point advantage in the state of Nevada on top of Joe Biden. And in 2020, Biden had a 4-point lead. And you can see the 8% shift to the right in favor of Donald Trump in this state. And when we go back to voter registration, Republicans had made gains over the last 4 years. Back in 2020, Democrats led by roughly 87,000, and now it's only down to 33,000. So Republicans have gained in terms of voter registration, and that goes to show you that this state is only getting redder. And so you compare this to 2020, in which Biden was winning Nevada by a lean margin, and now in 2024, all of a sudden, Trump has a lead by a lean margin. So this state has, significantly trended towards the right in favor of Donald Trump. So at this point in time in Trump's presidency, May of 2020, Biden was up in Arizona by 3.5%. And now, you fast forward 4 years later, you can find that Trump has a consistent lead in this state. So Biden was winning Arizona by a lean margin in May of 2020. And now, in May of 2024, Trump is leading. On average, Trump has a 3% lead in this state. And in my opinion, it's probably a must-win for Donald Trump if he wants to surpass 270 electoral votes. Because if he doesn't win Arizona, he's more than likely not going to win Pennsylvania or Michigan. And even if he wins Wisconsin, he's still going to lose the election if he loses Arizona. So Arizona is a must-win for Donald Trump. And it's not that much of a must-win for Joe Biden as it is for Trump, because Joe Biden can still lose Arizona but still win the election through those three Rust Belt states. So Arizona matters more to Trump than it does to Joe Biden. And so you compare these, polls. In May of 2020, Biden was up in Arizona by a lean margin. And in May of 2024, this time around, Trump is up in the state of Arizona by a lean margin. So you compare these two maps. We haven't finished yet, but so far, these are big, significant differences in terms of May 2020 polls and May 2024 polls. And now, moving on to the Rust Belt states before we end out this video, starting off with Wisconsin. So in May of 2020, you would find that Biden was leading in polls by 2.3% on average, which is completely different on what we're seeing, today, 4 years later. In May of 2024, Trump is leading in this state. Biden was winning Wisconsin by a lean margin in the 2020 election. And now on May 2nd of 2024, Trump is leading by nearly 3 percentage points, which is roughly a 5-point swing to the right. And if this is the true numbers on election day, Biden is probably more than likely going to lose the election. And so Trump is winning Wisconsin by a lean margin in this election cycle. Back in 2020, Biden was winning by a lean margin, and now Trump is. And now moving on to the state of Michigan, Biden had a 7 percentage point lead in the state of Michigan back in the 2020 election as of May. And so with that being said, that's going to be a likely margin. And was that actually the results on election day? No, it wasn't. He only won it by nearly 3%. So still a pretty good margin for Biden, but not as much as the 7% that he was leading in May of 2020. And you fast forward 4 years later, and you can find that Trump actually has a lead in this state, probably due to the fact that 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries. And so Trump is leading on average in this state by 1 to 2% in the state of Michigan, which was the complete opposite of 2020 polls that we saw Biden was up by a likely margin of almost 7%. And so when we compare these two maps, Trump is leading by a lean margin in this state, and Biden was winning it by a likely margin in 2020 polls as of May at this point in time in Trump's presidency. And then moving on to the last and final state before we close out this video, Pennsylvania. You would find that Biden, on average, had a 5 to 6 point lead in his home state, even though he currently lives in Delaware. He was still born and raised in the state of Pennsylvania. And you would find 4 years later in 2024, this election, Trump is leading in this state according to May polling averages. The reason for that is probably because Republicans have made gains in terms of voter registration. They've gained nearly 200,000 new voters, because back in the 2020 election, Democrats led by 686,000 in terms of voter registration. That number has decreased to only 400,000. And so that's probably the main reason why Trump is leading in this state. And you would see that there is a 7% shift to the right in the state of Pennsylvania in terms of the polls in 2024. Now, Trump has a almost 2% lead in this state, which is not good news for Joe Biden. Because if he loses the state that he grew up in, that's going to be completely embarrassing. And you compare this to the 2020 election, in which Biden had a lean margin lead in this state. And this is the 2020 map, according to the polls, as of May, basically this point in time in Trump's presidency. And you compare it to 2024, in which Trump is leading Pennsylvania by a tilt margin. And so that's basically it. Let me know your guys' thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. This is the 2020 polls as of May, basically this point in time. Biden was winning in May of 2020, according to polling averages, by 352 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 186. This map looks like a nightmare for Republicans. And you compare it to 4 years later, fast forward to 2024, this election, in May of 2024, Donald Trump is leading by 312 electoral votes to Joe Biden's 226. This is a major map shift in favor of Donald Trump. Nationwide, 4 years later, in 2024, the country and the nation has shifted significantly away from Biden. They abandoned Biden, and all of a sudden, Biden was leading with 352 electoral votes back in May of 2020. And in May of 2024, Biden is only at 226. So this is a major polling difference. And so that's all we have for this video. One last final reminder before I end out this video is to subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss out on any of my content. And also, if you are interested, we have memberships. You can find the link to that in the description section. And also, if you do give me a super chat, you will be shouted out in my next video or on my community page. Thank you everyone for watching.